I was very pleased to be invited to be here and to hear from people here in the days I'm here of what's happening here in South Australia. So thank you for the invitation. I'd also like to thank Mikey, who seems to have disappeared. Ah, hi. But thank you for your welcome to country, but also for your welcome to me. And clearly, because of our birth order, we will get on well. Yes. Right. Well, I'm talking about complexity, which is obviously, by definition, not a simple subject. And my interest in it and my understanding of it has come together from three very different sources in recent years. First of all, there was my practical experience of undertaking a review of the English child protection system. I don't know if any of you have had an experience at all like being at home one day and the phone rings and some Conservative MP that I know says, "We're just putting together the manifesto for the election. Can I put you down for doing a review of child protection?" So, because I'm a staunch Labour voter, I thought they're not going to get in, that's okay. But they eventually did get in. And you know, as a privilege, it is amazing to be able to step beyond writing scholarly articles about what they should be doing to actually having to put my money where my mouth is and actually come up with recommendations. So that brought me back into a lot more understanding of the complexities of the way things were working. But the other big strand in recent years is that I've gone back to my degrees are in philosophy as well as I've been a practicing social worker. And I became increasingly worried by evidence-based practice. It's one of those Chinese curse moments, you know, that may your wishes come true, that I had wanted social workers to be far more interested in research and the value that empirical findings can have, but I was not at all happy with the way it was actually being used in a rather simplistic, overgeneralizing kind of way. And I was lucky enough at the LSE to be able to get involved with a group of philosophers and other people involved in the welfare services. There's a group of us in something called Knowledge for Use, which is looking at the underlying philosophical issues of ontology and epistemology and all these very long words, but basically trying to look at the underlying philosophical issues around trying to make claims about what causes what. And so that has helped me as well to get a better understanding of how you can make some sense of complex causality without getting anywhere near to the simplicity of linear causality. And then the third big factor is that since I did my review, the government has reduced the controls of local authorities. They have a great deal more autonomy to change and do radical reform. And to begin with, nothing much happened. And it dawned on the government that just having freedom without money wasn't much use. So they created an innovations fund. And I was able to get a big chunk of money with Andrew Turnell, who developed Signs of Safety. And he had been very influenced by his own experience in training people in signs of safety and seeing how it functioned or didn't function around the world. But he was also influenced by my report, so that he had done a step back to thinking about what are the factors that enable a worker to engage with families. So he had developed much more of a whole system concept of what kind of organizational structure can actually enable somebody to go to a house and work with the signs of safety framework in a safe and effective way. So, you know, that mixture of incredibly practical and totally abstract is a fascinating one. And it's really brought together, I mean, it's not that I have any simple messages for you. And in fact, what I'm mainly going to talk about is the challenge I face at the moment, because Andrew and I and Terry Murphy and a number of other people, we worked with 10 local authorities who all enthusiastically embarked upon this journey with us, and some of them have absolutely flourished and are now getting judged outstanding, and some of them are now being judged inadequate. So, and some are just slowly plodding on in, so that their progress is remarkably diverse. So the researcher in me thinks, well, the advantage of that is I've got 10 case studies to try and tease out what happened between them. So that's the basis of what I'm doing in a final report, which will come out at the end of March. that's basically here what I want to talk about is the problem of complexity in systems, and then the challenge I'm facing around trying to work out what lessons we can get from this work we did on signs of safety, the limitations of RCTs in this context, and then the broad framework of what I'm working towards is the sort of realist kind of work around what works, not what works, but more when does it work, how does it work, for whom, and in what context. So a much more modest claim than the simple this works. Although, of course, like I think in many parts of Australia, the same thing, politicians always just want to be told, where do I spend the money to know what works? And they can't do it. So in many of the theories of change I've seen in the social works world, they are most theories of change. The idea of having a theory of change is a good idea, that you don't just, but this idea is usually done in a diagram something like this, of just a straight line of A, then B, then C, then D. And when I did my review of the English system, I took a systems approach to it, but I was also able to have a systems analyst with me to help me model what we were doing and to conceptualize it. So when we came up with a theory of how the English child protection system was working, it wasn't really like this, it was like this. And I used to be able to understand what that said. But it was basically capturing how we'd had all these series of very intelligent reforms, but they were tackling specific problems. And so they weren't thinking about how this solution affected other parts of the system. And the system had ended up getting into a self-reinforcing loop of more and more process. Whatever the problem, the answer was more process. And what should have been the balancing loops coming from the social workers and the families about this isn't working were being silenced by the system. So social workers tried to articulate what was wrong and failed to communicate to the government that they were being prevented from doing the kind of work with families they wanted. So they generally walked with their feet and left. We lost a huge number of really experienced child protection workers, and a lot of our most difficult work was being done by newly qualified social workers or Australians just off the plane. And and they may well have been good social workers, but when you don't know the society in which you're working, then you're a bit dangerous. But the other thing was that the whole system had started to judge itself against process and performance indicators. So the fact that families were screaming in pain from the whole thing and that the children were coming into care in huge numbers wasn't sort of recognized as a problem. So really what my review recommendations were doing was trying to put changes at key points to start putting the drivers going the other way. And that, in some of the local authorities where we're now seeing quite dramatic improvement, it is because they've done a completely radical whole system change. But I don't think we've made enough change in enough places yet to feel that we're past the tipping point. I feel we're still quite fragile, and that one major child death could make all the politicians cower back into process as their protection. So to understand what this the causal loop diagram shows in a bit more detail, and going to philosophy, I'm sure all of you are totally familiar with the concept of Inus conditions. Actually, I am sure you all understand them, you just don't call them that. But you know, where people have often talk about something being either a necessary condition or a sufficient condition for something to happen. Most of the things we deal with in the social world are neither. So I need to read this carefully. So an Inus condition is where there is a clear relationship between X and Y, but it's insufficient, but it's non-redundant. I mean, it matters, and it's, in this case, but it's unnecessary but sufficient. Now, insufficient but non-redundant part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. And before you start thinking that doesn't make any sense at all, think about what we know on the research about what factors lead to someone being an abuser. We know lots of things that when they're in the person's background make it more likely. But for any one person, there may be several of them, and they may be balanced by resilience factors and neutral factors. And you know, the complexity of the findings about human development in general, about what drives someone to be an abuser, are all, in fact, this kind of Inus condition of things that seem to make it more likely in certain contexts, but they don't determine it, and a lot of people can have some of those factors without being an abuser, in the way that children can be brought up in really adverse circumstances with one person really struggling as an adult and the other managing to come through well. So when it comes to measuring the effectiveness of treatments, you actually have the same issue, that in the social world, the kind of interventions that we have are not easily seen as a single variable that has the effect. You know, giving penicillin to somebody with pneumonia has a fairly, you know, straightforward causal impact and has a very big impact on getting rid of the infection. But the kind of work that we do is dependent on lots of other factors. And this is what Andrew had been finding with signs of safety, that when people kept thinking that you improve practice by training practitioners, and so they would send all their practitioners off on training courses in signs of safety, and then be a bit baffled why over the months all this enthusiastic adoption of signs of safety started to just fade away. And it was because nothing else in the system was supporting them to work that way. In fact, it was pushing them in other directions. So that you know, the idea that there is a single treatment variable, it is just never enough on its own to bring about the outcome you want. It's always about being part of a pie. And it won't work without the other slices. So in many ways, what I'm trying to do in the analysis of the progress in the 10 authorities in England is try and work out which other slices seem to be really important in the pie. I don't think I'll put it that way to the government. And also, even if something is generally has a tendency to be very helpful, if there is enough factors pushing you the other way, then it will prevent it working. And I think this rings true to a lot of social workers at frontline level, of knowing how they want to work and how they are praised for other things. You know, in one of the other states of Australia, I was saying to the senior managers how the practitioners were saying they were now given permission to spend time with families. And the senior managers were saying, well, we never forbade them to do that. You know, it's an obvious thing to do. And I said, no, you didn't, but you always checked whether they'd kept their records up to date. You praised them for having their records up to date, and you punished them for not having their records up to date, and you never mentioned their time spent with families. And so the covert message you send out is that that's something to do in your spare time. Because that was one of the other factors that happened in England. People were spending up to 80% of their time in front of computers, and then another chunk of time at interprofessional meetings. So the actual time of speaking to families was down to a tiny percentage of their working week. And the one thing that you cannot hope to do is understand a family by never seeing them. So, in this, very neatly moving on to trying to evaluate the signs of safety practice that we've seen and the reforms. And this is where, although I wish all of them had flourished and become outstanding, it's actually a real confirmation of complexity that this is the way that they are behaving in such varied ways. So instead of, Andrew has always had a theory of change, of what happens between the practitioner and the family, and how that can lead to greater safety from the harm of maltreatment. But he's now got a whole organizational system idea, which is seeking to make it easier to use signs of safety practice with the family and harder to do it badly. So it's recognizing how every element of the organization is influencing what actually happens. So we're seeking, as we implement, to put in the feedback loops that let us know whether we are implementing the work as we intended, or whether there is a drift away from the focus on the quality of help. Because that's the key thing. We want the main driver to be evidence about whether or not children are better off, rather than indirect proxies which get more and more remote from the reality for children. So he has now, instead of that rather linear theory of change, he has developed this one, which is I'm not going to explain it in detail, but on the left-hand side is the factors around the worker engagement with the family, but on the right-hand side there are the big chunks of the organisation, so around leadership. Should have got my glasses on, shouldn't I? The partner agency engagement. In England, we have a very strong statutory shared responsibility for child protection, so there is a higher rate of formal structures around working together with other agents. We don't have mandatory reporting. If somebody makes a referral to children's social care, they stay involved, and teachers have to come to the child protection conference. They can't just make a report. I think that's a much healthier way of working. But we also are concerned around the audit and inspection kind of process, what it is you're monitoring, and what it is the messages you're giving about what you value. So in this diagram, it's about changing the interactions so that they drive quality instead more than process. It's not that you ignore process, it's an essential part, but it's about keeping it in its place in the background. And I don't know if you noticed, but the circles are not quite cogs, they've got wiggly lines, and that's to represent the way that things tend to work in a certain way, but given a change, they can change shape. And that's, so it is, it's not like a machine where the cogs will always behave in the same way. That's why you need feedback loops to find out what they are actually doing. So a few examples of the causal drivers is this very clear message within the organisation about the value of casework discussions. This is, I'm not sure if the language is the same as you'd use here, but we had ended up with supervision being primarily about checking the process of case management, of their flow through the system. And it had moved away from what it needs to be around the discussion of the case, the reasoning, the emotional impact, and so on. We've also made a very clear pressure on treating the team as the place where you make progress rather than an individual reasoner, and that we value the level of informal conversations that go on in teams to actually help each other with cases and support each other. And our audit process had been both at local government level and by the national inspection people, had been purely a computer-based process of checking compliance with the process and making rather crude judgments about the practice from the limited information on the screen. And now we're using a collaborative case audit, which is where a senior manager sits with a worker and talks through a case, and we have a set of documents for guided judgment of what good looks like to help them. But it ends up being a very good educational process. The worker learns something just by talking through a case in detail, but also the manager is reminded of the complexity of real work. I think one of the problems in England was that managers had moved to the point of being remote from practice, so the only time they actually looked closely at practice is when they knew something bad had happened. And anyone can be very, very clever when they've got hindsight on their side. So actually looking at an ordinary case and not knowing where it's going to go is a very humbling experience for a manager, because it does remind them of how big, how important the decisions that workers make and the actions that they take are for people's real lives. Yeah, I think getting senior managers to remember what it's like is one of the crucial things that then they realise you can't make it all tidy and process-driven. So getting the leaders more involved with practice so they develop confidence in knowing what good is. If they understand what good quality is, they're better able to judge it. But they also, by showing that they understand the practice, they seem to be inspiring the workforce to believe that they will judge them fairly. And since at the heart of it, it's about trying to get people confident to take guidance as a broad guidance that you then interpret to this particular family and in their unique circumstances, that you need to feel that your judgment is okay, that you're going to be judged fairly. because judgment by its very nature is a fallible process. If you had an absolutely right thing to do, it would be a rule, not a judgment. And so we have to build up that confidence that you are able to use your initiative and your intelligence to say, look, this is generally the best way of doing it, but for this particular child, it isn't. And for being able to say, look, I know it's really important to fill in all these forms, but this child is so distressed at being removed from his parents that I need to put my time with him, and I'll get the recording done a bit late. Now, that may seem a very trivial and common sense thing, but it's actually quite a terrifying change when you've been only judged by whether you've got your records up to date. So these are actually quite fundamental cultural shifts. And then we're collecting a lot more feedback from families and evidence about children's safety to feed into judgments about what good practice is, but also what kind of quality of practice we're getting. And we haven't, in Ireland, we are working on developing a way of getting feedback from children who are not in out-of-home care, but actually just in the child protection system, who, oddly enough, there's masses of research of children who've gone into care, but none of that much bigger group of people children who've been exposed to a child protection experience, which, when you're on the edges of it, listening to your adults talking or being aware of your parents being very distressed, it's quite a scary process. So that's the 10 departments we worked with have got 10 different causal stories, which is a heartening evidence of the reality of complexity theory. So Ofsted is our national inspection process team, and they used to just do an inspection by going in and looking at computers, but they've changed their inspection framework because of my review, so that they are seeking to understand the quality of the service that children and families are receiving. So they will, looking at computers is one part of it, but they will also sit down and talk with social workers about cases. They will observe practice, and they will meet with families and talk about things. So they're trying to get a stronger sense of quality, and in writing up their reports, they're trying to praise the evidence of helping children rather than the evidence of having met all the performance indicators. It's surprisingly difficult to shift the paranoia in the society. Departments had been so obsessed with Ofsted judgments of the old style, with very good reason, because if you got a judgment of inadequate, the director got the sack. So he cared, or she cared, a great deal about not getting that judgment. And there's the suspicion of Ofsted as a sort of hostile person. It's proving difficult. It's starting to change, but because Ofsted want to see themselves as a critical friend more than an enemy, to be constructive and helpful rather than just a punitive person. But it's slowly, the ones who've actually had the inspection have generally found it wasn't as painful as they expected. But you need the inspectors to be driving the importance of quality for the organisation to be able to value it as well. Otherwise, in our system, it ends up being overriding. So, we've had 3 moving up to outstanding, 2 moving down to inadequate, and 5 making slow improvement up 1 grade. The judgments are god-awful. The one is inadequate. That's you wiped out. The next one is requires improvement, and the next is good, and then the final one is outstanding. And when they brought in these judgments, nobody got outstanding for a while, and I think it's only up to about 7 out of the 152 local authorities have got it at the moment. So there's room for progress. So given that that's what's going on in England, then it brings me to the point that our government believes that the only way you can judge anything is through randomised controlled trials. And they just want to know what works. And they've set up a What Works Centre for children's social care, who are, the researchers in it are far too intelligent to think that's the only mechanism for making a judgment, but they are rather hampered by the funding being from a government that only wants them to do RCTs. So they are constrained. But the obvious limitations are around, you know, the long road from it works somewhere to it will work for us. In England, the government has funded some very large-scale RCTs of manualized interventions from America. So the multi-systemic treatment and family nurse partnership were subjected to randomized controlled trials, and the results were that they were no better than service as usual. You know, when it's said to be this works, it means relative to something else that was in the control group. And you know, the control group in America of services as normal is radically different, even from Britain after austerity for many years. So that, you know, that's, to us, that those two big studies are very good examples of why you shouldn't take a naive view that something that works in one place will work for you in another. And so there's actually a lot of movement in public health and in international development, oddly enough, that are very strongly pushing back against that as a way of understanding the kind of work that they do. So pushing back against it within social work is not, we're not alone. And RCTs as a design are very good at establishing a causal link on a simplistic linear kind of way. And I'm not opposed to RCTs in themselves. In fact, 2 of my children are identical, and so I did a lot of mini RCTs. I would toss a coin, and one would get the expensive nappy cream and the other would have the cheap, and I would then see. And I bitterly regretted that I didn't have triplets, so I could have had a no treatment control. So it's not hostility to RCTs. It is about what questions can they answer. So, you know, there are 3 distinct kinds of claim in saying this works. The first is it works somewhere, which is in the trial area. The rather brief one that the politicians like of it works, which means sort of basically almost everywhere, widely or whatever. And then the final one of it will work here. It will work for us, that we have enough similarity with the place that it worked in. And that's where I think it falls down. But it's also, if you think about it, if you try to run a randomized controlled trial for signs of safety, what is the variable that you try to randomize? We've been working in 2 patches over 5 years with local authorities in terms of implementing the whole organizational change. You can't, what are you going to have as your control group? You know, it's just not feasible. But also, I mean, do you conclude from 3 up, 2 down, and 5 making minor progress that it works or not? I mean, that's not, to me, useful. And also, you know, RCTs are a black box approach in some respects, and that's not what we need here. It's about an understanding of how it works. What are you doing? So what the complex sort of evaluation methods are aimed at are not about a simple does it work or not, but much more modest claims about what tends to work, how does it work, for whom does it work, and in what kind of context. And I think that that kind of research, I think, can come up with useful findings for people, but it won't be the simple answer that you can buy off the shelf. And I think, particularly for social work interventions, I think there's going to be a lot of need for quite painful reshaping of departments and organizations to really grapple with the complexity of the work and the uncertainty of the work. I think we've been trying too hard to please the public's ambition that no child is killed by an abusive carer or parent. And I think we have to just acknowledge that however well we do the work, we cannot prevent all child deaths. And that we are primarily working with the thousands of other families that are not ever going to kill their children, but are where we can help them improve their parenting and make the children's lives substantially better. And I think that's in England now. There is a stronger confidence to say that we do not claim to prevent all child deaths. And there has been, when I did my review, the government promised that they wouldn't do any melodramatic instant blaming of social workers when a horrible story hits the headlines. We had in previous years, we had a Secretary of State for Education who, when the trial of the killers finally ended and it all hit the headlines, immediately went on TV and said that the director of that authority should be sacked because it was obviously due to bad practice, and it set fear running through the system, and even more frontline workers left at that point. So, since then, they haven't actually done much to help, but they have actually kept quiet, which is a godsend. And I think they've actually been a bit preoccupied with something called Brexit. Now, if you want a definition of complexity, there it is. And in complexity, we often talk about being on the edge of chaos. Well, I think my parliament's gone over the edge. So in terms of evaluating complex interventions, there's a growing world of trying to develop methods for it, and about not looking for universal truths, but probabilistic ones, but also of knowing the importance of the context, but also looking far more in having clear theories about how things work. I think research for many decades has got obsessed with statistics, which go in for correlations, and in certain ways you can say that a correlation is causal, but in ordinary life you generally talk about causes and you can explain how things have an effect. So it's about what mechanisms bring about the causal changes when, trying to improve frontlines' confidence that they'll be judged fairly. What mechanisms are seeming to have an effect? And one of the things that seem very clear in our authorities, one of the things that's very different between the strongest and the weakest, is the extent to which senior managers think they are responsible for improving the quality of frontline practice. And in authorities where senior managers try to delegate it to the middle management to deal with it, they don't seem to be able to actually make the cultural change, because the top layer seems to be acting just as normal, and trying just to change lower levels doesn't seem to work. But then when you look at what the leaders are doing, you get some very different examples of how they are changing their behaviour. So, but one of the things that seems to be common in the good places is that the senior leaders become visible. And some of them become visible by sitting in on duty for a while and listening in to how cases arrive. Some of them are visible by doing a collaborative case audit every month or so with a different practitioner, and showing how much they appreciate the challenge of the work. A lot of our authorities now will have a one-day conference where you showcase good practice, because people are trying to talk more about the minutiae of practice. And in some authorities, the director turns up and opens the day and then says, "I hope you have a nice day," and tootles off. And in other places, the director arrives and sits through it all, and at the end says something about how much they've learnt from the day. Guess which ones tend to be doing better? But I'm hoping in my work that I can tease out some of the sort of minutiae of how people did things and different ways of doing them. So I'm hoping that at least that could be an interesting read. So I like this diagram, just that, social systems are not physical objects, but they are operating in a similar way. And particularly in child protection, I think, there's the sort of multi-agency, multi-professional networks of people that you tend to have involved with families, and also the families themselves. But within an organisation, even the accounts department actually has an impact upon what can actually be done. And so you are wanting to have an understanding of quite what are the ripple effects of things that happen, and what ways people have changed. One of the things that's turned out to be surprisingly difficult to change is the IT system. The government had imposed a system on everybody called the Integrated Children's System, which was god-awful. Actually, how's the time? A nice little story about that is, it began when social work was in the Department of Health. And so the Department of Health did the proper groundwork of engaging with the users to find out what kind of software they needed, what were the tasks, the context and all that. They did all that lovely work. And then the Labour government transferred children's social work over to the Department for Education, an obvious place for it to be really, isn't it, rather than health. But it's just now a little pimple within the Education Department. And the Education Department took on the task of designing a software for the country, but decided that they would do their own thing. So they ignored all of the research and just went ahead and designed software without consulting anyone, which is why it doesn't work. And then they did actually commission an evaluation of a pilot use of the software, and they got the report and decided that the report was not fit for business because it actually concluded that the software wasn't fit. But anyway, they then, again, as a result of the review, they told people they didn't have to use this, they could innovate, which is lovely, except it takes millions of pounds to change software, and they had no money. So they have been tinkering, but even with infinite money, actually creating a software that can genuinely support and help the reasoning processes is going to take us quite a while, I think, to create. And we're making some progress. And again, there's some good examples of progress being made on that. But overall, the context matters. The 10 authorities we've got were chosen in a fairly haphazard way, basically of them coming up and saying, we heard you were planning to do this and we'd like to be one of them. But we also, having got to about 8, we then sort of checked what we had to see if we had a fair diversity of cities, counties, big and rich and poor areas and so on. So within the authorities we have, they're of different sizes. Some of them have got basically very rich population with a smaller number of poor people. Others are parts of London with a very poor population generally, and those things have quite an effect. And then the organisational level differences were quite dramatic of where they were starting from. Some were already called inadequate and some were much better. They began from different places. And then, of course, there's the differences in the families. And there's a lot of ethnic diversity within England. So in some areas, you'd have a lot of particular ethnic groups and not in others. And then there are now this focus on, this is the contrast of what we have been having, no, sorry, it's that slide, isn't it? Alternative ways. There are these developing mechanisms. There's no sort of dominant one, but qualitative comparative analysis is basically what I'm trying to do with my 10 case studies of comparing the key variables in our theory of change to see whether those that have become outstanding have actually done more of the implementation of our theory of change, and if not, what they have done. But there's also dynamic pattern analysis, which is my dream if we actually get a good software that's capturing the key variables in a way that you can analyze. One of the things that frustrates me about most of the really expensive softwares around the world for child protection is they don't allow qualitative analysis. They are done in a way that allows you to classify boxes, but not the content. And I just think it was such a wasted opportunity not to be able to do that. And then realist synthesis is looking at the evidence for the different stages in the way of working. So, within signs of safety, the engagement with the family and the talking respectively, being clear about what your worries are, listening to the person and listening to their strengths and showing that you want them to succeed and involving them in decision-making. There's a lot of evidence from psychotherapy about what helps at that stage. So there's ways of building up the evidence base for the different steps in the work. And then there is that ending up with a much more modest set of questions which don't please politicians because they're more complicated. But it's around for whom does it work, under what conditions does it have an impact, and how does it do that, and having the causal feedback, the feedback loops within the way you're working, so that you actually know what is happening, not just to families but within the organisation, and developing a causal model. So the person who worked with me on the review, the systems analyst, has contacted me wanting to muscle in at this late stage in order to see whether we could create another impressive diagram that I won't be able to understand after a couple of years. But I will see. That's an interesting thing to try and do. So basically, I think that what we've been dealing with a lot is the intervention-centered approach, which is the focus upon the actual intervention itself. And what I have shifted to much more is the context-centered approach, which is trying to focus on the overall arrangements in the target context to study in a much more detailed way what is happening, how people are experiencing it. You know, every source of information becomes evidence in this kind of way of working, of studying, so that hearing stories from the workforce about what changes. We've been doing a parent survey over the 5 years, which captures the quality of their relationship with their worker. We've been doing staff surveys that include the safety attitude questionnaire from aviation about when people report certain attitudes within their day-to-day work experience, that as a high score goes with a low mistake error rate and a high, the other way around for a high rate, so that things about the context of your team, the sense of being supported by your team, the sense of senior managers understanding your work. We have some nice quantitative data on that. So we've been trying to get lots of rich sources of different types of data, plus all the performance data that the government still requires, and which nobody seems to actually then look at after they've collected it. So that is me getting to the end of my time, and I've just put up a couple of references. I should have also put up, actually, I'm not a business person, the third edition of my book, Effective Child Protection, is coming out at the end of November, and that it sort of captures my journey from realising how bad the first edition was. So we now move to Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eileen. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation. Just a couple of things that I've drawn from your talk tonight that I just wanted to share is that opening of the importance of how social work uses research and also actually getting in there and actually going to the practice and getting in and actually helping. So asking those questions about, you know, what tends to work and for whom and how does it work, I will definitely take with me. I also just want to particularly highlight the message that you've given us tonight. I think that's relevant for researchers, for managers in the sector, and that's about not letting research or organisational processes and managers drift away from the practice. And so the importance of listening to practitioners and families who can be silenced by systems and processes, I don't think we can ever forget in this work the importance of the lived experience. And so how things work is what I took from your presentation as a wonderful question that we have to keep asking ourselves, and also the importance of the qualitative analysis in research, particularly in this space, can't be ignored. So thank you, Eileen. It was a wonderful presentation.